In March 2020, St Michael's Church in Lichfield organised a Lent course entitled Caring for God's Creation. This Lent course was brought to quite an abrupt halt by the start of the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown. I was due to be presenting the second of the workshops in that series that was entitled Who is My Neighbour? Climate Change and Global Impact. This was never actually presented, so I'm taking the opportunity here to talk through my slides and to say what I would have said at the workshop and to perhaps encourage some discussion of the points I make. The title, as it says there, is Who is My Neighbour? Climate Change and Global Impact. And I'll be looking at the big issues of caring for God's creation. And the particular big issue I'll be looking at is global warming. There are other big issues, such as the effects of plastic pollution on the sea, that are important, equally important, one might say. I'm taking this one because it's actually something I know a little about professionally and can talk about knowing what I'm saying, which isn't always the case. What I'm going to do is I'll say what global warming is, first of all. Then I'll talk about what I term the scriptural imperative to do something about it, based on Luke chapter 10. And then I'll ask the question, what can we do? Talking about mitigation, adaptation, thinking about what we can do as a church, maybe, and what we can do as individuals. So first of all, global warming. I think this is fairly well known now. Global warming is caused by the greenhouse effect. Solar radiation warms the Earth. Some of it's absorbed by the surface of the Earth. Some of it is reflected and would, under the normal run of things, be reflected back into space. However, the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually absorbs some of that greenhouse gas, that radiation, and disperses it back, at least a part of it back, towards the Earth. In other words, it basically doesn't let all the solar radiation that's reflected back out of the atmosphere, and gradually the Earth warms. Now, this, I think, is now scientifically an established fact. If we look at the temperature plot here against decade from the 1850s, we can see that it remains fairly stable, but then over the last 3 or 4 decades begins to increase significantly. This particular graphic is, I think, a particularly vivid one, as it shows the variation of monthly average temperatures over a century or more on a circular plot. And you can see that up to about the 60s or 70s, it remains within bounds and then begins to take off during the latter years of the 20th century and the early years of this century. And indeed, should we plot January, February, March and April of 2020, we would see that it would have increased even beyond those levels. So global warming is happening. It's a scientifically established fact, and it's not really arguable against now. The effects, well, one of the major effects is to cause glaciers to melt, and we're seeing that effect already. And if we think about the effects on England and Western Europe, they could be really quite substantial, with low-lying areas of Holland in particular being threatened, but also East Anglia and the Wash, and indeed the Thames estuary. And the Thames barrier might quickly become outdated and unable to cope with high tides in the couple of decades' time. On the other hand, it will lead to droughts, it will lead to wildfires, and indeed is already doing so. Parochially, if we think about the effects on England, the bottom left-hand corner shows the temperatures of summer 2019, very hot summer, and those summers will become the norm over the succeeding decades. The rainfall, I think, on the right-hand side, the January rainfall, the temperature on the right-hand side across Britain there, and we can see there again a significant increase during the significant temperature anomaly shown there, right across England and Scotland. The broad effects of global warming on this country will be warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and more extreme events, which will lead to events such as the one you see at the top right, where trees are blown down more frequently, causing more and more disruption to our life as we know it. So that's what's going to happen, is happening. Come now to the second part of the talk, the scriptural imperative. In a sermon I preached in February, I argued that there were 3 scriptural drivers for doing something about the environmental impact of humanity. The first is the principle of creation outlined in Scripture, that we are stewards of God's creation and we need to take that stewardship very seriously. I then argued that the second point was due to the concept of the new creation, that God, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, is making all things new, is redeeming the world, is in the process of making the world new, of creating a new world that will finally be revealed in the new heaven and the new earth, as described in the prophecy of Revelation. And that we are part of God's plan to bring about that new creation. The third scriptural imperative is that of neighbour love, and it's that I particularly want to talk about in this presentation. In Luke chapter 10, we read, "On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he asked, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'What is written in the law?' he replied. 'How do you read it?' He answered, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself.'" The young man's reply was based upon 2 passages in Deuteronomy. And these 2 passages, and others in fact, form what is known as the Shema, the daily prayers of the Jewish people. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts." And later, in Deuteronomy 11, another part of the Shema, we read, "So if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for the cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied." Interestingly, in the light of this presentation, some very significant parts of the Shema seem to be saying, if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, then the whole creation will be in some way more harmonious. You'll be able to live with creation in a more harmonious way, and all your needs will be provided. Jesus took these words from the Shema, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength," and he put them together with the words, "and you shall love your neighbour as yourself," from the book of Leviticus. Other people were doing it around the time. It wasn't a particularly innovative thing to do. But Jesus then summed up these words when he repeated them elsewhere in the Gospel as saying, "On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And these are words that we hear in the prayer book communion service, at any rate, on a week-by-week basis. Jesus said to the young man, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who then is my neighbour?" Who then is my neighbour? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he told a parable that we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jerusalem to Jericho was a rather arduous trek. I show there Jerusalem in the left-hand side, Jericho on the right-hand side. About a 30-mile trek through some very inhospitable countryside. And the story, as we know, is that the man was set upon by robbers. He lay at the side of the road. He was passed by some very good religious people who fundamentally ignored him until the Samaritan came by, a hated northerner, if you like. The Jews and Samaritans didn't speak to each other. But the Samaritan tended this man's wounds and put him on his horse and took him to the inn and paid for his keep. And Jesus turns the question then back on the young man. Who then is my neighbour? If we think about that situation again, Jerusalem and Jericho are about a day's journey apart. Samaria is about 2 days' journey from Jerusalem, something like that. If we think where we could get to in a day, or maybe a couple of days, we would draw a circle, an ellipse that looks something like that. We can get pretty much anywhere, maybe with a few exceptions. And it seems to me that Jesus, in the teaching that he gives in the parable of the Good Samaritan, defines the word neighbour in much more than local or ethnic terms. He defines it in universal terms, which for us is, of course, much more about everyone in the world rather than simply those in our own locality. The parable of the Good Samaritan ultimately says that neighbour love should be shown to everyone, not just to those next to us, near us. Who then is my neighbour? The people of the low-lying islands in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific that are going to be existentially threatened by sea level rise due to global warming. Those in Australia threatened by wildfire and by drought. Even those in this country who are threatened by a sudden excess of extreme storms. And here we have pictures of Goldbrookdale from earlier this year. Who then is my neighbour? And of course, we know the answer. But it still leaves the question, what then can we do? There are a number of ways that we can go forward. First of all, we can mitigate the effects of global warming, and that means cutting our carbon emissions in some way or other. And we can also help to adapt. We can help the vulnerable who will be affected by the effects of climate change. Even if we stopped emitting carbon now, there would still be those who will be affected. A little while ago, I did a carbon audit of St. Michael's Church activities in 2018. And here I show the figures for tons of carbon that we produce. From our gas consumption, we produced in 2018 10.2 tons of carbon. From electricity, 9.9. From our transport activities, these are very rough figures. I had to make lots of estimates. We produced about 7.5 tons from car use. From the choir trip to Venice, about 4.6 tons, because that was carbon-heavy, short-haul airline travel. From the trip to Camas, about 1.4 tons. So the total for 2018 was 33.6 tons of carbon. The average emissions per year of a house from heating and lighting is about 3.8. The average UK car emissions is about 2.8. That gives a bit of context. If we think about our average total emissions per person per year, the UK is about 10, Germany much the same, USA about 20. Brazil about 2, Zimbabwe about 1. You can see the disparity in production of CO2 in carbon emissions, mainly in the developed world. So what can we do? Well, we could take seriously the results of audits such as one I've done and begin to adjust our behaviour, and that's easier said than done. We can also engage in what I might call carbon advocacy. Use whatever influence we have to argue for an increase in renewable energy production, land and sea, and that might not always be a popular thing to do when it comes to arguing for the use of wind turbines, which some people don't like at all. Argue for increased use in public transport provision. Argue for increase in electrical charging points so that electrical cars can be used to a greater extent. That's not a complete panacea, but it's part of the solution, I think. Then we can help with adaptation. I've talked about mitigation so far. We can also help with adaptation. There's a well-known schematic that's used in some circles that shows hazards such as might be driven by climate change, floods, heat waves and the like. And it shows the people who are vulnerable, vulnerability, the poor, those who live in substandard housing, those who live on floodplains. And it's where hazard and vulnerability cross that we get disaster. And it's perhaps at that sort of level in the region where disasters might occur that we can help, I think, as a church, by primarily helping the vulnerable. How? Through overseas giving to support aid agencies and emergencies. Again, to use this idea of advocacy, arguing with whoever we can for increased overseas development aid by writing to the papers, writing to our MPs if that's your thing. In the UK, I wonder if we could use church buildings in emergencies. They're actually ideal places to use in times of heat wave and drought to keep cool. And again, we can advocate for increased flood protection, increased emergency health provision. What can we do as a church, as individuals? These are points to ponder. I'm not going to give answers. I'd make one suggestion as a church that we could look again at a carbon audit for a church. We could do that for our individual lives as well. And that would perhaps give us some context for making what might be quite hard decisions, but to draw to an end. The 5 marks of mission of the Anglican Communion I've written out there, the first 4 are perhaps what one might expect: to preach the good news, to baptize and nurture new Christians, to respond to human need, to transform unjust structures of society. But the 5th, to strive and to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. Caring for creation is central to the mission of the church, I would suggest. Jesus also said, and it's recorded in the words of the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Jesus calls us to be a light on the hill. He calls us to be the salt of the world in an adjacent passage to that one. We shouldn't underestimate that. We shouldn't underestimate what effect our lifestyles and how people can perceive that we live on those around us. And if we are seen as caring for God's creation in the way we live, in the lifestyles we adopt, then that can be a very powerful witness indeed to others.